World Jam Global Radio presents
All Because the Lady Loves.
Your World Jam DJs on the night will be Early B spinning the best in future grooves. Also you'll have DJ Mac, DJ Laro from the original Emotion Sound. Also Younger General from Black Mountain Sound. Performing on the night will be Camilla Marcel singing her new single Life. Also we have Sugar Ray performing his latest single Shake It Down. There will be loads of giveaways on the night. Also prizes for the best dressed couple, which will be judged by our professional photographer coming from Cool Vibes Studio. Prizes for the best romantic dancing couple on the night. Of course we have our own judges, which will be the Dirty Rub Up crew. We'll be checking that out, so look out for that one. On the 14th of February 2018 at the Junction House, 578 Kingston High Road, London, E84AH. Tickets for this Valentine's affair is set at £20 for couples and £15 for singles. Tickets available at the following: 3Ws, worldjamglobal.com, located on the events page where you can click and purchase your tickets, or on the ticket hotline number of 07802 302450. You can also purchase tickets from any of the World Jam Global DJs performing on the night. Dressed to impress, professional photographers on site all night.
All because the lady loves.
World Jam Global Radio, this is Clarity.
I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I
want to say a big good evening going out to each and every single one of you tuning in to World Jam Global Radio's Issues Today. Saturday the 13th of January.
I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Well, once again, we're going across the states.
I paid for my crime.
And I have a very intriguing guest.
Back in the day, I didn't really care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die. I had too many rivals. I was too young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the streets. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent, I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison.
We've got a young lady by the name of Mary Mooney. She's going to be talking about how she was kidnapped, criminalized, and lied to by the American government to stop her in her endeavor to save the broken lives of Ethiopian children who are prime for adoption. International adoption, abandoned children. That's the feature for today's show.
I'm trying to get this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen. Statewide, world.
Just doing all my final checks.
There was not a
setups.
I was good with my
technical adjustments.
On my feet, I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man, don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do.
It's our first show for 2018, and you're in with live with Dr. Kirby Julian and my guest Mary Mooney. We'll be talking live in just a few moments.
Do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb.
Feature is international adoption and abandoned children.
Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common.
Story of how a lady, a woman, a mother
like a real alligator,
was kidnapped, criminalized, and lied to in a pursuit of rescuing children with broken lives and broken families from a once wealthy continent that didn't need our aid until we kind of went in there and messed stuff up. That's my take on it. Don't forget you can get us on www.worldjamglobalradio.com, or you can tune in via the smartphone app TuneIn. Available on all internet formats, Safari, Google.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
And don't forget you can also catch me tomorrow morning, 8 till 10 a.m. GMT. That's for my Wake Up Everybody Sunday Gospel show. That's where I do church before church. Gospel in a whole different way.
And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
And it's been a long break over the Christmas and the New Year, and it feels great to be back.
All those drive-by killings.
This is our first show of 2018.
About nothing. He who was out sin, let him cast the first.
And we're going to hear a very dramatic story.
Get this felony off my back.
Stand by.
My life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen, statewide, worldwide, and put down those knives. Stop stabbing each other. Yeah.
Well, without any further ado, let me introduce you to my guest. She's been waiting in the wings for some time now. She's a social worker and an activist, but I'll let her introduce herself and tell you all about who she is and what she's doing, what she's done, what she's been doing, and what she intends to do. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Mary Mooney. Hello, Mary.
Hi, how are you today?
Well, it's a cold day here in the UK. I'm not sure what it's like outside where you are, but it's go on.
I live in North Carolina, so it's a bit cold, but probably not as cold as it is where you are.
I doubt it very much. But hey, here we go. Anyhow, Mary, I suppose when we come onto a show like Issues Today, it's never to tell people about great news. There's always some sort of a story behind it. But if you just care to introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about yourself before we start talking about the nitty-gritty.
Okay. I am now 58 years old. I live in North Carolina. I've worked in adoption since 2002 and have not worked in adoption since I was arrested in 2014. But I started in adoptions because my husband and I at the time were unable to conceive children, and we started trying to adopt, and I realized how difficult it was to adopt. And we stayed on waiting list, and during the time we were waiting to adopt, we were able to conceive using in vitro fertilization. It took us 8 years, and we finally had 3 children. I have 3 children who are all in college now and are doing well. And I started my business in adoptions because I got so involved trying to adopt. Although we never did adopt, I was involved with it. I was advocating for adoptions, advocating to adopt children out of the U.S. foster care system, which is very, very difficult. We tried for probably 7 years to do that. And started doing home studies. Since I'm a social worker, I have a degree in human services, I was qualified to go out and do home studies for people trying to adopt. So in 2002 in North Carolina, I started a company and started providing home studies for people adopting domestically in the United States or internationally. After I did that for approximately a year, I started meeting a lot of people in the adoption community. I attended workshops and trainings and joined professional organizations and learned about the international adoption programs. More and more people, starting at about that time, 2002, more and more were adopting from different countries. Actually, the highest number of international adoptions, over 24,000, took place in 2004 from the United States. Bringing in children from all over the world. So 2004 was probably the height of international adoptions. So I was starting to work then. I had friends that I'd met through professional organizations come to me and say, well, you've got an adoption agency. I adopted 2 kids from China or Haiti or Ethiopia, and there's so many orphans out there, you need to start a program in these countries. So slowly I started working in various other countries, and that's basically how I got started in international adoptions. Not sure what else to say about me, other than I do have a passion for helping children. I've placed hundreds of children, a lot of handicapped children, and I've left children to die because they were unable to be adopted for one reason or another, not proper paperwork or too sick to be adopted. I've traveled internationally, seen a lot of happy things, but I've seen a lot of sad situations too. Some orphanages that are not, where the children are sick. These children that come into international adoptions, they're not, just like in the foster care system in the United States, these children are available for adoption because they are abused or neglected or they don't have any family to look after them. So that a lot of these children that we place do have, have gone through some serious issues as young children, losing parents or being abused. So there's a lot of social work that goes into dealing with the children that are in need of adoption.
In doing these adoptions, and you mentioned the fact that that's what you were working with as a social worker. You worked in the adoption industry. What sort of profiling did you do on the child or on the family? What was the significant criterias in matching child with family?
Well, first you start out with for an international adoption, the first step is the family has to have an adoption home study, which involves fingerprints, background checks, federal background checks, proof of income, proof of job, visits to their home to interview all the children that are there, reference letters. They have to jump through quite a few hoops to do the adoption home study. And then after the study is done, they have to pay, the fees vary to the United States immigration. They pay a fee of $6.95 or something like that. It might have gone up. And that home study is sent to the immigration department in the United States. And at that point, they do a federal fingerprint check. They review the documents for the home study that was completed. and the family has to get issued what's called a I-171 form, which is permission from the United States government to adopt. So for the family to even get matched with a child from a foreign country, that family has to go through those hoops, which sometimes can cost thousands of dollars. Getting all those background checks, letters from their job, and various documents to prove who they are and that they're they're good people. And so that's the checks and balances that go on the family side. The checks and balances that go on the child side depends on where the residence of the child, what country the child's from. Each country has their own regulations and criteria how to decide if a child's adoptable.
We've had in the media over the years, for example, some real horrid stories of children being adopted for slave labor, for example. What areas of compatibility are triggered, for and against a match? For example, we're talking about children in Ethiopia in particular, in your case, but there's children all over the world as far as international adoption is concerned, of all different cultures and nationalities. So what's the triggers of compatibility?
Well, what we look at is when a family comes to us and wants to adopt a child, we look and say, okay, how many children do they have in their home? What's the appropriate? For example, a lot of agencies do not feel that a family that already has 3, 4, 5 children should adopt another child. Yeah. Or if they do adopt another child, that child be the youngest child in the family. So, for example, we might have, and this happens a lot, a couple's divorced and then they've remarried. So they come to us and they're in their 40s, which is a bit old to be getting a baby. And they may have a couple children from a previous marriage, but they're too old to conceive, but they want to start a family together. So the social worker that's handling that, or a team of people within the agency, would evaluate and talk to the family, provide them with educational materials if they wish to adopt an older child, because these children may have some disabilities that are unknown, psychological disabilities. It's important for that family to recognize that there's a possibility the child might have attachment issues. We actually have families that come to us. We actually would have families that come to us and say, I would like, God has called me and I want to adopt a child with a handicap, or I want to adopt a child with some kind of special needs. And so those families that identify themselves as wanting to adopt a special needs child, they have to go through even more hoops and more education. With the new regulations that came down in 2008, the U.S. government requires every family to have at least 10 hours of training on adoption, and there are different areas that they're required to be trained in, such as the possibilities of mental illness and problems with attaching to the child, since a lot of these children have been in orphanages that aren't the best and have received minimal contact. They do have we worry that some of those children might have some attachment issues. So that's where the social work issue comes in, the matching of the child and the parent. But a lot of these foreign countries actually do the match. Like in Ethiopia, when I was working in Ethiopia, the women's MOA, Ministry of Women's Affairs, they would actually do the match. Now the agency would, or the organizations working, would suggest that Mr. and Ms. Jones adopt, a certain child, but the actual official match usually comes from the foreign government. The foreign government looks at the home study and the documents from the family from the United States, and then they look at a home study, or actually it's called a child study of the child. Why did the child come into care? Does the child have any living relatives? Does the child have any disabilities? What's the child's health issue? And they do the official match. If the child has a disability and the family's home study does not approve them with a child with a disability, that match can't happen. So there's a lot that goes into making sure that the family and the child are a good match, because we would never want to match a family with a special needs child unless the family has the resources, the time, and the ability to meet that child's needs.
So what would you do in a case of a child who comes to a family and the child appears to be settling well, but the parents have taken a dislike to the child?
Well, that happens. That is a big concern. We call it a disruption or disillusion. And sometimes people do adopt children, and after they're adopted, they don't feel like it's a good match. And there's been quite a bit of scuttlebutt with people disrupting and trying to replace their children. But in the United States, when a family brings back a child from a foreign country, that child, there was a Citizenship Act some years ago. So that child, say for example, a family adopts from Ethiopia and brings the child to the United States, that child is an automatic citizen of the United States. So if that child and that family, or the family decides they don't want that child anymore, then that adoption, if they try to give up that child, that adoption would actually become a U.S. domestic adoption. Just like a citizen in the United States, say a birth mother in the United States decided to give up her baby after she gave birth, that's a domestic adoption. This would be the same thing. The family would relinquish the child according to U.S. laws because that child has become a U.S. citizen.
Right. But you've obviously worked in adoption for many years, and I would imagine you'd have seen more people appropriately placed, successfully placed, than not, right?
Right. The reasons most people disrupt is the child has behaviors that they weren't prepared for. And a lot of social workers, step in and try to help the family mend and get some treatment. But I've seen situations where a family adopts a child and it's just not a good match. The child has some behaviors and the family's or some medical issues, and the family is not prepared to spend the time and effort that it's needed. And so, in my opinion, it's better to replace the child immediately into a home that is prepared for a special needs child, because it's in my opinion, it's best for the child to be in an environment and a home with parents that want to spend the time to help them with their special needs.
I mean, when you think about it, these children are coming from some real broken lives, and when you're talking about countries like Ethiopia, for example, where there's a lot of war and famine and poverty, and disease, you have children losing their parents at early ages, or being abandoned at early ages.
Yeah, and I've seen. I've had a couple of instances where I placed a set of twins, and both the girls had watched their mother be murdered by the mother's boyfriend, and they both went into the same home, and one child ended up in a mental institution and the other child ended up going to college and being highly successful. It was, one child was unable to overcome the trauma and the other child was able to overcome the trauma. We had one little boy that was about 4 years old in Ethiopia, and he was one of the youngest. We went out to an orphanage where there were no babies at the orphanage. It was all for older children. And at night, it was such a dangerous area where the children were. At night, the women that came and cooked and looked after the children went home. And it's actually the older boys that kind of looked over all the kids at night. So it was a very dangerous place. And we had a family that was adopting a little 4-year-old boy that was there. And when we got there, I just felt like the boy was obviously going to have some issues. And so we contacted the family and advised against adopting him because they had not requested a special needs child. But the family insisted that they had the resources, and they got an addendum to their home study to adopt a special needs child. And they were adamant they loved this child and were going to do whatever they could for him. And we placed him, and he turned out getting awards for soccer, and it's been a great placement. So it's in my opinion, it's when I've watched all these placements, you have families that say, oh, we want a special needs child. We have the resources. We can handle anything that comes our way. And then they accept a referral of a special needs child, and they're not prepared. You know, it throws them for a loop. And then you have these families that, you know, get a child that has special needs that's unknown, and they're not prepared. They do a great job.
Sorry, Mary, is it their understanding, is it their perception of what special needs are that's in question? Are they really in the know, knowledgeable about what special needs means? Are they taken aback by the extent of the special needs?
I think what happens is people are, because I was there, you know, when you can't have children or you really want a child, I think you get very desperate, and you want a child so desperate, and the agencies provide education. The agencies tell them, you know, we would even go in and say, we need a list of the doctors you're going to use, what facilities you have near you, you know, what special needs services do you have in the school system where you're at, and get them prepared. And some, you know, listen to everything you say, and some actually are prepared. And then I think other families just are not realistic, and they think that all they have to do is love a child and everything will work out. And I know you have children, so even raising the most normal child or children can be difficult.
Absolutely.
So when you get a child that requires, you know, visits to the doctors on a weekly basis, you know, extra medical attention, extra psychological attention, that wears on you. And I think some people think that they're prepared for that, but they aren't. And so I think that's where the disruptions or disillusions come in, is when families realize once they get a child that they're just not prepared, and they don't want to put out the time and resources that are needed. And a lot of people are against the disruptions, but I feel like it's in the best interest of the child to remove that child from a home where they're not really wanted. If the family's not going to spend the time and effort the child needs to meet the child's needs, the child's better in a placement where there is a family that wants to meet that child's needs.
Have you ever had cases where they've been there longer than, say, the normal time is expected for decisions or perceptions to be made, and then it turns sour later, and you've got to intervene at a later date, a much later date than anticipated?
No, I've never been involved in that. I've seen some, other adoption agencies where children have been placed for like 5 or 6 years, and then they come back and say they have problems. But I have friends that have birthed children and find out at the age of 16 the child's bipolar or schizophrenic. So I think the problems that arise aren't necessarily just because the child's adopted.
It's a breakdown in a relationship as such.
Yeah, and children have issues whether they're adopted or not adopted.
Yeah. Unfortunately, when they're your own children, you can't give them back, can you?
Well, you could. That's what I mean. These children, when they're adopted, they are your own children. But what I meant by was your biological birth children. You can't just give them back if it goes wrong, can you? Yeah, your biological birth children, they have problems too.
Absolutely.
So, and I don't know the numbers on if there's any difference in adopted children, but I try to explain to people these children are not in orphanages. They're not in the foster care system because they're loved and well taken care of. They're there because something traumatic has happened. Either abuse, neglect, or their parents have passed away and there's no family to care for them.
So, a lot of good work has gone into trying to pair parents who are desperate for children, and more importantly, desperate to help a broken child, and a broken child that's in desperate need of a loving home. And these things have gone on for as long as any of us can remember, where you've had war-torn countries and countries that have had all sorts of issues over the years, wars and famines and all sorts of stuff, and children have needed to have been got out and been given new homes in order for them to be able to continue with their lives. So why are we now at a place where here I'm talking to what sounds like a knowledgeable woman, a passionate woman, a woman who knows what the adoption system is about, and knows what the child needs, knows what the parents need, and knows how to put them together and assess whether that can work or not. So why am I talking to you today as a woman who is at loggerheads, so to speak, with the local authority or her local government about international adoption?
Well, I don't know why, but the United States is not favorable to international adoptions. I think there's a lot more into it than I know. I can, give you some statistics and information from some other people. And I'll just read some of this information, give you a background about international adoption. From 2008 to 2016, the number of inter-country adoptions has declined from 24,000 to 5,000 cases. So we've lost just under 20,000 adoptions lost. There's been an 80% decline in international adoptions in the past 8 years. People want, what's the decline? Well,
before you go any further, has the desire stopped? Has the need?
No. There's no decline in the desire to adopt. There's more people seeking to adopt. There's plenty of Americans looking to adopt.
And there's plenty of children that need to be adopted.
UNICEF, has staggering numbers of orphans and children in orphanages across the world. There's no limit to the statistics you can find about the number of orphans in the world. There's what I consider like to be a false narrative. They want to cut down international adoptions because they're worried about trafficking children. But the U.S. 60% of victims that are trafficked, children that are trafficked, are usually, they're not done by licensed adoption agencies.
I wouldn't have thought so.
No, the trafficking children is done by people that just snatch them up. A lot of the trafficking children are children that age out of orphanages because they weren't adopted. They get to the age of 16 and the orphanages kick them out and they have nowhere to go, so they end up in prostitution in various countries. There's been an article written about UNICEF and the Department of State's war on international adoption. UNICEF is a big proponent of keeping the children in their country of origin. They say they're not against international adoption, but they want the children to stay. They feel the children being adopted to other countries lose their heritage. So they advocate for the children to stay in their country of origin, with international adoption being their last resort. So I feel like UNICEF has been a driving force in closing adoptions, because UNICEF makes their money on poor, starving children in foreign countries, and they feed them and look after them. And if adoption agencies place them for adoption, then they won't be poor, starving children in foreign countries anymore. But there's probably a lot more political things behind that I'm not knowledgeable about.
In our opening segment, we mentioned that you were kidnapped, criminalized, and lied to. So let's start with number one, kidnapped.
Well, Yeah, I was kidnapped by the U.S. government.
Tell
I
us,
had
tell us more about that. Tell us how that came about.
Okay. I was actually going back and forth between Belize. I went to Belize in 2008. I took my young children there. They attended school while I was trying to develop an international adoption program in Belize. We stayed there for quite a while, and I came to the conclusion that Belize was, although the regulations were in place to do adoptions, it was going to be difficult, and so I decided that I would not pursue opening an international program in Belize for the company. I fell in love with Belize. I partnered with a friend of mine and had started a rental company of management, property management, and so I had been traveling back and forth to Belize, staying for months at a time. In 2012, I had stopped working in international adoptions in late 2012. I was only doing adoption home studies in North Carolina. Adoptions had dropped off so much that I kind of saw the light and realized that the government was not supportive of international adoption. So there was not a lot going on. So I was just going back to what I had originally done in 2002. 10 years before, and I was had a partner, and we were doing adoption home studies in North Carolina, and then I was starting my new business in Belize, and my children are here. I have 3 children that are still in the United States, and their father had passed away, so I was flying between Belize and the United States on a fairly regular basis. I'm coming home for Christmas, coming home for Thanksgiving, that type of thing, and on February 11th, 2014, at 4:30 in the morning, I received a banging on the door. I was in my condo by myself in Belize, and it was approximately 6 Belizean local police officers and a U.S. Marshal, and they said they had a warrant for my arrest. At the time, I had no idea what I was being arrested for. It was 4:30 in the morning. I had gotten out of bed trying to find my glasses. They let me put on my clothes and get my passport. I didn't get my pocketbook. I didn't get any of my belongings. And it's been 4 years and I haven't been back. And I was told I was being extradited, but after my research, I found out that it was really what's called an illegal rendition. The government never asked me any questions about adoption. Before I had learned, later on, I'd learned that 4 of the people that worked at the nonprofit adoption agency I had worked at had all been arrested and all been indicted January 21st, 2014. So the government never knocked on my door and asked me any questions about how we were processing adoptions. They never have, in the last 4 years, wanted any information from me. I've never been able to tell my side of the story. But the government, my sister was trying to find me. My daughter was trying to find me. They were all told I was being extradited, but the extradition process would have involved me appearing in a court in Belize, and the judge in Belize would have decided if there was enough evidence to send me back to the United States. And I was not given any due process. I was not given any Miranda rights. I was just taken from Belize and flown back to Miami. The Belize people were very nice to me. And I was just told that there was a warrant for my arrest. I didn't know why.
Okay, and then how did that progress for you? I mean, what was your take on that?
Well, after some research, I actually had a plane ticket for 2 weeks later for a ticket to come back to the United States. I didn't understand Number one, why, they could have called my children. They could have called my office. They could have called any of my family members and said, look, we have a warrant for your mother's arrest. We need her to turn herself in. I would have done that. I don't, I was flabbergasted that the government would spend so much money and time to arrest a 54-year-old, 154-pound woman that doesn't own a gun or had never had a violation of the law. I was taken out like I was some, the government did in their public announcement call me an international ringleader. It was all done for sensationalism. I think for political reasons. The government is trying to make it look like adoption agencies across the United States are all corrupt. All adoptions are corrupt. And I think it was just done for sensationalism. They did the same for the other gentleman, one of the other gentlemen that was arrested. They basically showed up at his house, I think at like 7:30 in the morning with machine guns and trucks and, held his whole family, hostage while they gutted his house for information and documents. Just kind of a surprise ambush when all they had to do is knock on the door and we would have all turned ourselves in, given them any information they wanted.
I mean, you'd have imagined that if they had done their homework, they wouldn't have had to have sensationalized such an arrest plot.
No, but I think that's the typical. I've the past 4 years of my research that I think they do that. The government does that for a shock factor. They do that on purpose. I think they do that to show their power. I think they're bullying, being a bully, and I think they do that to scare. They were trying to, scare me so that I would be cooperative, which, I've always agreed to be cooperative, but they don't, never really wanted to hear anything I said because they don't want to hear the truth.
So they kidnap you?
Yet.
And then they criminalize you. How?
Right. I was two police officers escorted me on the plane to Miami, flew to Miami with me. And when we arrived in Miami, the announcement came on board for everybody to stay seated. And the marshals came onto the plane and escorted me off and carried me through the airport, just made a real scene out of it.
Do you have any relatives in the mafia or?
No.
So you're not a gun-toting hooligan thug crime boss?
No, my father was a lawyer. I grew up in a small town called Reidsville, North Carolina.
But here we are on a plane, and they keep everybody seated, and they board the plane to escort you off like you're one of the most wanted that have just been caught trying to leave the country.
Exactly.
How did that feel for you, though?
I was just in such shock. I still didn't know while I was arrested. I still didn't know.
So you wasn't aware that it had anything to do or related to adoption?
At that point, they had not shown me the indictment. I didn't have anything.
So what did you think they were taking you off the plane for?
I didn't know.
Had you been rowdy? Had you drank a couple of bottles of vodka too much? Had you assaulted the aircraft crew? Had you tried to overtake the plane? Did you?
No, I think I slept most of the way back because they had woken me up at 4:30 in the morning, and by the time we got on the plane, it was about noon, and I think I was in physical shock, mentally. I was just doing what I was told.
I mean, they kind of reserve that kind of behavior for terrorists, wanted mobsters, and that kind of thing.
I know I'm kind of jumping to the end of the story, but the original indictment on me has been dropped. So I really think that I'm probably the only person that's been kidnapped and taken out by legal rendition, and then the actual indictment be withdrawn. I can't find any other cases where someone has been all the cases that I've found have been people like El Chapo or, just, the gun-toting heroin drug dealers get taken out like that, So,
But here's little Mary Mooney.
Yeah, like I said, I'm 154 pounds. I'm 145 pounds, 54 years old, single, living alone. 3 children. No criminal record. Social worker.
Any parking fines, parking tickets, speeding tickets?
Not that I know of.
Clean as a whistle.
Yeah.
But then they're taking you out like Al Chapo.
Right. And the thing is, I had booked a plane ticket. This was in February. I had flown back to the United States for Christmas. I had flown back in January for my niece's wedding. And I had a plane ticket to come back. I think it was March the 8th, and this was February the 11th. So, I'm sure they tracked and saw I had flown back and forth probably 4 to 5 times in the past 12 months. So if they wanted to get me, all they had to do was be at the airport when I arrived.
Wow.
They didn't. They could have picked me up in the Miami airport when I came back in March, or they could have picked me up when I had flown in January.
So they've got you. They've now marched you off the plane. Where did they take you? Did they take you to a police station, to a prison? Where did they take you?
Well, in the downstairs of the Miami airport, I guess they had a little room, and so at that point they took my cell phone from me, and They asked me if I wanted to talk, and I said, well, talk about what? And they said, well, you need to talk to us. And I was like, okay, well, what do you want to talk about? Well, at that point, they told me something about international adoptions, and I said, well, I don't understand. What do you want to know? And they just said, you need to talk. And I was like, well, I really don't understand what this is about, and so I guess I need a lawyer. And they said, well, once I asked for a lawyer, they said, okay. They put me in the back, handcuffed my hands behind my back, put me in a police car with, I guess they were marshals, I'm not sure, two men who proceeded to drive approximately 80 miles an hour down the Miami highway, swerving in and out of cars. I assume that was to scare me. Took me to Miami Maximum Security Prison, and I got there, and they gave me one phone call, which I called my sister, who had it already been, I don't know how many hours, at least 12 hours since I was taken from Belize, and all my friends were looking for me, and they'd contact my sister, they'd contact my older daughter, and they were all trying to figure out where I was. They were told that I would be taken to the U.S. Embassy, which if you were formally extradited, that's what would have happened. But I wasn't taken to the U.S. Embassy. I was just immediately put on an international flight and flown back. So I was able to call my sister, let her know that I was in Miami, where I was, and then she was able to contact a lawyer to start the process to get me out of Miami Maximum Security Prison, which took approximately 10 days to get me out.
And so the 10 days that you was in Miami prison, what was going through your mind? What did you think was going to be happening now?
Well, naively, I just figured it was a lot of misunderstandings that I would be able to clear up. I thought once I was able to talk to the prosecution, and once I was able to find out what the issues were, that I could, clear up the misunderstandings, whatever they were, and I didn't know what they were. The next morning, I was taken into the judge for arraignment, and I was standing before the judge, and the judge said, how do you plead? And I said, plead to what? And he said, well, you're charged with, it's 18 U.S.C. 371, which is a conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. How do I plead? And I said, well, Your Honor, I really don't know what this is about. And I could tell the judge was pretty upset that I didn't know anything. So at that point, there was a real nice public defender that came over, and I told him, I said, I have no idea what this is about. They said it's about adoption, but all I've seen is one piece of paper that says I'm to be arrested. I have no idea what it's about. So at that point, the judge just, said, y'all need to do something with her. And so he went over to the prosecution, the federal government, and asked them for a copy of the indictment, which I had never seen. Gave me a copy of the indictment, which was approximately 31 pages. And so I sat there, which I had no water. The policeman had given me food and some drink, but at that point, I probably had not had anything but maybe 3 ounces of milk in about, 12 to 16 hours or more. I haven't had anything. And so, I had asked for water, and of course they didn't even have any water in the courtroom. So I sat down and read the 31-page indictment, and the public defender asked me if I needed some help, and I said yes. And so he represented me, and I pled not guilty. And that was, that first day, and that's the first time, it was a good 24 hours before I was able to even understand why I had been arrested.
Okay, so now I want to. This is about one of the strangest wrongful convictions that I've ever had to deal with or share on my show. So, 54-year-old woman, 145 pounds, 3 children, not a criminal conviction against her name, not even a speeding ticket, squeaky clean by all intents and purposes, without trying to make you out to be an angel.
I may have had a speeding ticket or two now.
Okay, but now you're in a jail, in a prison with cons, with convicts, with murderers and thieves and prostitutes and drug takers. How did that feel? And what was? And didn't anybody come up to you and say, "Well, what are you in here for?" And when you told them, "Ha ha ha, you must be kidding."
Well, no, it was kind of just opposite. I was in a maximum security prison. Most everybody in there, because it was Miami, spoke Spanish, so a lot of times the guards were yelling things in Spanish. I had no idea what they were saying. Luckily, I had a very nice cellmate. She had just given birth. Of course, her baby wasn't with her, but she had just given birth, and she was in for mortgage fraud. What was very interesting about my 10 days there is I don't think in the section they put me in, there wasn't a single violent woman there. Most of those people were in there for mortgage fraud, things that there was no reason for those people to be in there. They could have been out with a monitoring device. There was a woman in a wheelchair that she said that she was with her boyfriend when he got in trouble, and she was with him when he robbed something or whatever, but she was in a wheelchair. She wasn't going to bother anybody. There were many older women that were fairly sick that and I think some of them were in there for doing something like maybe it was some kind of fraudulent palm reading or some kind of internet kind of stuff. But that's what took me back is the women were very nice. It wasn't the inmates you needed to be worried about. It was the guards and the people that worked there that you needed to be fearful of.
Was it a very corrupt regime then?
I don't know. I wasn't there long enough. I don't think it was corrupt. I just think it was they treat the inmates very poorly, and some of the male guards at night were fairly nice. If there was some TV on that the women wanted to watch, he'd let people stay out of their rooms for longer if everybody was behaving. And some of the women did act fairly childish. And most of them were there waiting to be transferred to another place, to a minimum security work camp to serve their time. A lot of them were there just in a holding cell, to like me to be moved to another. Because I was in Miami, my case is actually out of Charleston, South Carolina, because the adoption agency was licensed in South Carolina. So the case actually is a federal case out of Charleston, South Carolina. And so because there was a snowstorm in February in South Carolina, they had to fly me into Miami. That's how I ended up in Miami instead of South Carolina. But those 10 days were fairly interesting. I could write a book on just those 10 days. I was mostly just shocked by the type of women that were serving lots of time for nonviolent offenses, such as, embezzlement of or mortgage fraud, and those women all had, a lot of them had children, had families, and in my opinion was a waste of government money to have those people locked up when they probably could have been monitored in a different way in their homes, back working and with their families.
Did you find that most of those that you were locked up with, banged up with, so to speak, did you find that they were very supportive of you and almost gobsmacked that you could even be in there?
I don't think any of them were gobsmacked, because a lot of them were in there for,
yeah.
A lot of them were in there and shouldn't have been in there anyway. Yeah. They were very supportive. The lady that I was put in with was just very sweet. She immediately told me when to go out of the cell, when not to go out of the cell, what guards to ignore, when I should go out and use the computer to email. There was one guard in particular, a woman guard, that was pretty nasty, and when she was on the floor, we would stay in our cells and not go out. She because I was new, you have to be there a couple of weeks to be able to order stuff from the commissary, things like ibuprofen, eye drops, extra food, things like that. So, if I needed anything, like, if I had a headache or anything like that, she shared her things that she already had with me, which was very sweet of her. Everybody was very friendly. The only thing I saw the women argue about is the different religions. There was only one group to have Sunday school and church in, and they would have a little tiff every once in a while about who got that room and how long they could have it. But that, there was a nice little place to exercise. And so the women that I was in with were very supportive. Like I said, it was the guards and the people that worked there and the social worker in charge, and those people are the people you wanted to stay away from.
So you're in prison. You're in there for 10 to 11 days. You're deliberating about how you managed to get yourself in this. You're trying to work out what kind of a plan they have for you and what are the charges and how that's going to pan out. What was your lowest point while you was there?
Well, there were a couple things that happened that I try to eat a very healthy diet, and I have an issue that if I eat a lot of spicy food or food with preservatives, the inside of my mouth will peel or my tongue will crack. And so I was trying to be very careful. I was trying to drink a lot of water, trying to exercise. My main issue was I've got to stay healthy. I've got to stay healthy, because I saw some women that were sick, and you do not want to be sick in prison, because they're really not going to help you very much. And so my goal was to stay healthy. I lost 10 pounds in 10 days because the food, it's all preservatives. The meat was, a preservative meat, like sandwich meat, which has stuff in it that I can't eat. So there was a lot of stuff that I couldn't eat. If they'd have gave me beans and rice, I could have ate that all day. But they give you sandwich meat and canned vegetables and canned things, and there were very little vegetables, very little fresh fruit. We did get an orange or an apple on Sunday. You'd get one piece of fruit. The first day I got in there, like I said, I hadn't had any water. So I go in. The first night they put me in the shoe. The shoe is where they put you when you're bad. And I never really understood why they put me in there, but I think what happened was when I showed up, they asked me to sign a bunch of paperwork, and I asked if I could read the paperwork, and the lady snapped at me and said, well, I'm getting off work, blah, 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 and she got mad at me, and so I said, okay, I'll sign it. Well, I asked for a copy of it. I never got a copy of it. I asked my lawyer for a copy of it, never got a copy of it, so I think they were mad at me because I wouldn't just sign all these documents, which I ended up signing when I had no idea what I signed. So they put me in the shoe, which is an isolated place, which is terrible, that you never want to go. So when they finally sent me over to the regular jail, the regular prison cell, and assigned me a place, I still had not had much water or much food or anything, and it had been a couple days. And so I immediately went over to the sink and started drinking water with my hands from the sink. And this big African American woman came over and gave me a cup, and and that was my cup. So then the next day for breakfast, I go to get in the breakfast line, and they had cereal, and they had milk, and they had coffee. But if you didn't have a bowl, or you didn't have a cup, or you didn't have anything, you couldn't get any food. So you had to buy a cup or something. So all I had was that cup until someone else, another inmate, would give me a plate or a bowl. So when I went up to get my breakfast, I could either get a cup of coffee or I could get some cereal in my cup. And they served everything was sugar. There was heavily laden sugar cereal. And when I eat a lot of sugar, I get a headache. So it was just sugar cereal or this bread that had sugar all over it. And I came to find out that they're required to give you a certain number of calories per day. And so that's how they give you the calories, by giving you lots of sugar. And so I had to make friends so that I could get a bowl or get something to put my food in. Now, when they fed us lunch, we did get a tray with the food on it. But for breakfast, or if you wanted to get water, you had to have a cup, and somebody had to give you a cup, or you had to buy a cup. So unless you made friends with the other inmates, you weren't going to survive.
Wow. So you managed to make friends, and you got to your low point, and then eventually. So what happened is, after 11 days, was it back at court before you were released, or?
No, actually, my sister and brother hired an attorney, and he was able to get me released. The government objected. They thought that I was a flight risk. I guess they thought I was a dangerous flight risk, and they objected. They wanted to keep me, but I was lucky that the judge released me. My sister came down to Miami and picked me up, and I've been out on release. I've been out on what's called pretrial services for 4 years. It'll be 4 years, February 11th, that I was arrested. So I've been out almost 4 years on, I call it, it's pretty much like probation. I have a probation officer that comes to see me in my home every 3 months. I'm limited where I can travel. If I go out of town just for the day or for the night, I have to let him know. I have to stay gainfully employed. I have to report anything to him. I can't have a gun. I'm pretty much like on probation, but it's called pretrial services.
Right. Okay. So here you are now. You've had a passion for adoption. You've worked as a social worker for all these years. You've worked with families, you've worked with children, you've put some successful cases together, and now all of a sudden you're now being hauled through the courts and through the prisons for the one thing that you've done as an occupation and a career for most of your life. How did that leave you feeling?
Well, I've at the time, like I said, my father was a lawyer. I was brought up in I believed in the justice system. I still believe in it, but I've gotten to be an advocate for the Innocence Project and wrongful convictions, and I am just shocked at how the justice system works. Like I said, I was naive. I thought that once I got a lawyer, and once the lawyer and I sat down and went over the indictment, and I explained what was wrong and the misunderstanding of the regulations, and that the government had used laws that were in effect in 2012, and they were talking about cases that had happened in 2006, 7, and 8, that things would be cleared up. And that was just not the case. The government didn't want to hear anything I had to say. My lawyer, I spent $46,000, and another attorney $4,000. So I was out $50,000, which was pretty much all my savings. At that point, I had to take a public defender. And I was shocked that my public defender didn't want to do anything other than plea me out. They didn't want to look at the evidence. They didn't want to look at the regulations. The government kept quoting what they said, this law and that law. And I said, well, show me the law. Show me the law. They never could show me the law. It's as if the government just makes something up, calls it a law, but yet will not, there isn't a law that says that. I have an article that is interesting. I have some statistics, and one of the articles that I found that was really interesting was written by Dr. Dane Kluntz. She's executive director of the Center for Adoption Policy in the United States, and she says, this article was written a couple years ago, talking about the decline in international adoption. And she says the Department of State has adopted UNICEF's policy, which is that international adoption is to be shunned. It is if the Department of State and UNICEF, which advance the position that countries should reject international adoption as a method for family formation. Basically, what she says is that her feeling is that the government, I'm trying to find exactly, the government is trying to make it look as if all adoptions are illegal.
All adoptions or all international adoptions?
All international adoptions. It says each. I'm trying to find it in the article. There's a lot on the internet that talks about a lot of accusations about unethical adoptions, but yet there has been few adoptions agencies arrested. And so I think what happened, our agency was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the government keeps saying there's all these fraudulent adoptions, but yet they have not pinpointed any. Such as in our case, they said the adoptions from Ethiopia was fraudulent. They were fraudulent adoptions, but not one adoption has been overturned. Not one child has been returned back to Ethiopia. Not one visa has been found to be issued illegally. So all this talk about these fraudulent adoptions, there's nothing there.
Do you think, was there an approach to try and encourage national adoptions? Was that the issue, that national adoptions were being ignored while people were pursuing international adoptions? Was that the case?
No, that's not the case. That the domestic adoptions in the United States has nothing to do with the international adoptions. I think what she says in this article is the Department of State often uses fear of fraud as an explanation for his actions, basically saying the Department of State is trying to put the fear of fraud in everybody to shut down adoptions. Yet when the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services examined over 2,000 Ethiopia cases, actually what happened was there was all this claim of fraudulent Ethiopian adoptions. So the USCIS, which is U.S. Immigration Service, flew down some representatives to Ethiopia, and they researched over 2,000 Ethiopian cases. And as officials, they could not find any wrongful adoptions. I think of all the 2,000 adoptions they went through, they only denied one. And what she says in her article, it's almost as if the Department of State wants fraud to exist as an excuse to end all international adoptions. And then there's been some testimony before Congress, particularly about international adoptions, because the Hague Convention was passed in 2008, and there were some more regulations that came down, And then they were trying to increase the regulation some more. So there was some testimony before Congress. And with the implementation of the Hague Convention in 2008, the Office of Children's Issues, which previously had the responsibility of issuing orphan visas for children, they were designated as the central authority for adoptions. And so the State Department is in charge of regulations of international adoptions. And what people as the program grew in Ethiopia, the U.S. Embassy in Addis and the Department of State in Washington started issuing public warnings about the weakness of the Ethiopian adoption system. The State Department felt like there was some unethical things going on. And so the State Department started investigating Ethiopian adoptions. And in response, in January of 2011, a team of investigators from the USCIS and the Department of State traveled to Addis Ababa to review the adoption program in Ethiopia. The team conducted a comprehensive review of information for 2 years preceding. USCIS actually took 2 years of adoption cases from Ethiopia. They investigated 4,000 adoption cases from Ethiopia that occurred probably around 2010, 2009, and they issued a public report in April of 2011 of the supposedly allegations of illegal adoptions going on. Of those 4,000 adoptions, they didn't identify any adoptions from International Adoption Guides, the agency that I work for, as having anything wrong with them. They actually found one case that they felt had problems out of 4,000. Kelly Dempsey testified before Congress and said that because of all the problems, the embassy in Addis Ababa, instead of they kept thinking there were so many problems with these adoption cases, they didn't want to adjudicate them. So families would adopt the children in Ethiopia. They would submit their documents to the embassy to get a visa to bring the child back to the United States. But what Kelly Dempsey says is the Department of State, the orphan petitions were also entitled to priority treatment at the U.S. embassies, and simply setting a file in a drawer, that the embassy was actually setting the files in a drawer and not adjudicating them. So the embassy was hindering these people to get their children out. So you have an adoption process in Ethiopia that takes approximately a year or so to do, and then the U.S. embassy is taking the cases and just putting them in a drawer and not even looking at them, causing the families to spend, the children to spend an extra 8 or 10 months in an orphanage. And so I think there was some political stuff going on between Homeland Security and the embassy. And starting in September 2011, USCIS was getting calls from waiting families that became aware of the drawer full of cases at the U.S. Embassy in Addis. In response, a team of 4 USCIS officers went to Ethiopia in November of 2000 to resolve the outstanding cases. The team spent 2 weeks working at the embassy and processing the 65 drawer cases, as that's what they call the infamous Addis Review Room. At the end, all but one case was approved. So the U.S. Embassy in Addis, claiming that all these cases were done illegally or there was some fraudulent activity in these cases, the USCIS went down there and of all the cases only found one. So all these rumors of unethical and illegal adoptions, the government could only find one case out of 4,000 that they found something wrong with.
And that one case out of the 4,000 that they found something wrong with, did that have anything to do with you or your agency?
No, that had nothing to do with our agency.
And so,
As a matter of fact, our agency was accredited by a Council on Accreditation, which accredits agency using The Hague, which Ethiopia is not a Hague country, but our agency had never had a substantiated complaint. We hadn't been in trouble. I've got documentations from the U.S. Embassy where the U.S. Embassy had been emailing the State Department about different agencies and allegations of fraud, and none of those mention our agency. None of them.
so has there ever been an explanation given to you that can justify how they might have come to their decision to handle you in particularly the way that they did when they boarded the flight, for example, took you off it, interrogated you, so to speak?
Well, when the case started, the government started to dribble some discovery to us. And not until almost 3 years did I get what's called the agent's summary of the case. I was not given the agent's summary of the case until 3 years later. And once I got the summary of the case, I kind of was able to put together why they picked International Adoption Guides, why they came to arrest us. And what happened was there was a 4 families that filed complaints with the Council on Accreditation, and the Council on Accreditation found no substantiation for those complaints. And so the families were upset. So they then filed complaints with the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia. And this was about the time that this political pull was going back and forth. You know, everybody kept saying there were fraudulent adoptions in Ethiopia, but yet they couldn't find any. And so these 4 families came up and said, look, we use this agency. We think they placed our children aren't true orphans. And that's how the case started. And what happened was the 4 families that complained, their adoptions had been completed in 2006, 7, and 8. The complaint came into the embassy in 2012. Well, the regulations that were in place in 2012 were substantially different than the regulations that were in place in 2008 and 9 when these adoptions were done. The way I explain it to my friends is that if you took your 2008 taxes and you had them audited by 2012 tax laws, you'd probably find something wrong. So that's what happened. There was quite a bit of misunderstanding.
Based on the current legislation, according to the legislation that was in place when they adopted.
When they adopted. The biggest misunderstanding was the definition of an orphan. People just assume an orphan means a child with no family, no parents. Well, according to when the U.S. Embassy gets a case, they have to adjudicate the case and issue a visa. And when they adjudicate the case, they look at all the documents about the child. And they look at their definition of an orphan. And an orphan can have a living parent. If that parent has relinquished their rights to that child, then to an orphanage, then that child has no parents. The issue was these families that filed the complaint, a couple of them knew their child had a living parent. And they knew that because we had just, when they picked a child, we said, your child's mother relinquished him because she is poor and unable to care for him, sick or what other reason. And in Ethiopia, that parent would appear in court in front of a judge and relinquish that child. So when the child's relinquished, the child becomes an orphan. Well, there was a form with the embassy that says, does your child have a living parent? Not a living parent. It says, does your child have a parent? And it was called checkbox 16. And of course, we would tell the family to check the box no. The child does not have a parent. And the family thought that we were having them give false information by checking the box the child had no parent. But it was the correct box to check because the child has no parent if the parents have relinquished that child.
Yeah.
So there was a big misunderstanding. So that was the first misunderstanding. Well, when I found out that misunderstanding, I went back and I found a PowerPoint presentation given by the U.S. Embassy, giving our agency as well as other agencies instructions on how to fill out that form, and that the embassy told us if the parent had relinquished the child that this is the correct checkbox to have the families check. So, but why would we have the parents check that box that says the child has no parent? The documents given to the embassy showed that the parent showed up in court. So the embassy knew that the child had a living parent because the parent was present in court. Yeah. But on the checkbox for the visa, the parent checked no parent. So that caused confusion. It caused such confusion that the U.S., at the recommendation of the Ombudsman's report to Congress in 2010, the U.S. actually changed that form to clarify that form. Right. So that one form and that one misunderstanding, I think, was the basis for the arrest of the agency personnel.
Wow. And so,
because the families were saying that we were placing children that had a living parent.
Yeah.
Which was not against the law.
I mean,
but the government thought it was.
But what I can't understand is how the government would think that it was without having a conversation with the organizations or the agencies that had to manage those forms. I mean,
well, they did. They interviewed the embassy, and they asked the embassy this question. They asked the embassy, the question is it against the law for the agency to place a child with a living parent? And the embassy said yes, because it is. If we had placed the child without the parent relinquishing the rights to that child, it would have been illegal. But we did not place the child. We placed the child after the parent had relinquished the rights.
Okay, can I ask a question then? Do different adoption agencies have different types of paperwork that states different things that could cause this misconception?
No. There are the process is on the Ethiopian side. The adoption is done according to Ethiopia laws, much like in the United States. For example, in the United States, if a mother wants to give up her child, or father, whatever, wants to give up a child, they relinquish that child through a court system. In Ethiopia, it's done the same way. They relinquish the child through the court system. Once the child has been relinquished, it's only at that point the child can be placed with the adopted parent. Okay. So that is the process. The confusion came in at the embassy state. At the embassy, the embassy didn't even understand their own. The embassy didn't understand their own forms.
Okay, but do we not have, in something that is as intricately important as adoption, child adoption, etc., do we not have I refer to it where I work as control documents. In other words, for example, I can come up with an idea of how to manage a particular area in my workplace of work, and I create a document that needs to be signed and completed by those that partake in this, right? But in order for me to make that a standard document, I've got to pass that through the correct system and turn it into a controlled document that everybody has access to. So it gets an IP address on the system, it gets signed off by a senior manager, it goes into a particular file, and then anytime anybody wants to carry out this particular activity, they draw this particular document, which is a controlled document that everybody is common practice. Do you not have what's referred to as a controlled, something like that, a controlled document?
Yes. I can run through the process in Ethiopia. Basically, what happens is when a mother or a cousin or a relative has a child they want to place for adoption for various reasons, they go before a local tribunal, local elders, a local court. And the local court has to make a decision what's best for that child. Say, for example, the birth mother's a prostitute and she's not taking care of the child. The local court at the local level writes up a report. 3 people have to verify that the woman's poor or the uncle can't take care of the child or whatever. And so that local authority says the child can be adopted, and the local authority looks at what's best for the child. Then once the local authority makes that decision, the child is placed in the care of a guardian. Now that guardian can be a local adoption agency. Now our agency was licensed in Ethiopia. We were also licensed to run an orphanage because we were one of the first agencies to get into Ethiopia, and we were licensed in 2006. So the guardian of the child would be, they didn't have a Department of Social Services per se, so the local Ethiopian orphanage would take guardian of the child. And if they thought the child would be placed for international adoption, they would set the child to live with a U.S. agency. So the child may come into care, and then the court would say, look, we're going to give XYZ Ethiopian orphanage, where they're going to be the guardian for the child. And a lot of times there wouldn't be a place for that child because that orphanage was so full. So the orphanage would place the child into our care, into the IAG care center. So we would be caring for the child as a foster parent, per se. And the Ethiopian orphanage would be the guardian for the child. At that point, the adopted parent study and the study on the child would both go to the Ministry of Women's Affairs. The Ministry of Women's Affairs would look at the documents and say, okay, the family looks like they're approved. The U.S. government's approved that family. Then they look at all the documents for the child. Sometimes they research where the child came. If the child was a foundling, that means found on the street, they would place ads in papers. They would look for relatives that might want that child. If the child had been relinquished by a birth parent, they would look at the court documents. Then when the Ministry of Education, the Women's Ministry would make a determination the adoption could go forward, they would issue a letter. All those documents would go to the Court of First Instance in Addis Ababa, and there would be a court date set. At that court date, a representative of the adopted parents, which would be the U.S. Adoption Agency, a representative for the child, which would be the guardian of the child, which would be the Ethiopian adoption, the Ethiopian orphanage, and a representative another representative for the child, which would usually be even if the birth mother had already relinquished the child, the birth mother or the birth father or the grandmother, whoever, would show up in person in court. So the judge would look at all the documents. They would look at the U.S. parents' documents and ask questions of the U.S. Adoption Agency. They would look at the Ethiopian child's documents and ask the guardian of the child any questions. And they would look at the birth mother or the person that relinquished the child and ask them any question. And the judge would make the decision on the adoption based on all those documents in front of him. Then once the court had issued the adoption decree, all those documents then would go to the U.S. Embassy, and the U.S. Embassy would then adjudicate the case, look at all the documents. They may even call in the birth mother that relinquished the child and ask her questions again. So the adoptions in Ethiopia went through way more scrutiny than the adoptions that take place domestically in the United States.
Wow.
Quite a few steps.
Categorically, you mentioned the tick box which said parents, no living parents.
Well, it's actually said no. Does a child no parent? That was the confusion. They changed that. The U.S. government changed that form later on, and I think the confusion was that several of the families that we placed children with did have a living parent, but they were under the impression by checking the box that said no parent that we were asking them to lie about the child having a parent. But in reality, if a child's relinquished in a court of law by the parent, after the child's relinquished, they have no parent.
Okay, so that particular tick box Was that a standard tick box on all the agencies that were doing adoption, or was
Yes.
just on your form?
No, that was on all. That's the form. It's called an I-600 form that goes into the U.S. Embassy.
So that's what I'd refer to that as a controlled document.
It's a controlled document. Not only was IAG telling their parents to check that box, every adoption agency was instructed by the U.S. Embassy that is the correct box to check if the child had been relinquished in a court.
Right. But yet the American government still chose to get that wrong.
Yeah, they realized later on that they misunderstood. And also, like in the indictment says that children, one of the children that we placed basically did not live in. What they were saying was the contracts for adoptions were false.
Okay.
The basis behind that was that the children were not living in the orphanage that signed off on the contract for adoption. But there's nowhere in the Ethiopian law that says the child had to live there. The guardian for the child signed off on those contracts, which was perfectly legal. What happened in July of 2009, there was a new regulation that required that children reside in a Ethiopian orphanage for 2 to 3 months before they were placed for adoption. But that regulation did not come into play till July 2009. All the cases in the indictment were completed 5 months prior to that. So the regulation the government states in the indictment was ex post facto. The government was investigating the case and using the wrong regulations. The regulations before that, in May of 2008, which only involved one adoption, said that a foundling, a child that was found on the street, could not be placed for adoption for 2 to 3 months. And the reason the Ethiopians had that regulation was so that if a child was found in the street, the Ethiopian government would have 2 to 3 months to try to identify a family for that child. So they didn't want a foundling. Well, the government in their indictment left the word out, foundling. They just conveniently left that word out. And they said we were not holding the children for 2 to 3 months before we placed them for adoption. Well, there was no need to hold the child for 2 to 3 months if the child had been relinquished by the birth parent. So there was just a lot of confusion, and the government, like I said, the complaints the family lodged were complaints, mostly the families adopted in 2007 and 2008. The investigation was going on in 2012. The regulations had substantially changed by then. So they were using the wrong regulations. Well, there were guidelines.
Sounds like somebody jumped the gun without reading the paperwork.
Right.
But it wasn't just a simple case of jumping the gun and getting the paperwork wrong. People's lives were turned upside down in the meantime.
What is so devastating to me is the government has gone out and told hundreds, if not 200 or 300 children that their adoptions were done illegally. Now, can you imagine being a teenage adopted child from Ethiopia and your parents tell you that your adoption was done illegally?
And now your fear is that you're going to be removed from the one place that you've been safe.
Right, but yet the government has not found one of our adoptions that needs to be overturned. As a matter of fact, if you look at the USCIS website about international adoptions, USCIS posted information about the arrest of the IAG staff and said they have found no adoption that needs to be, they have found no evidence of any adoption that needs to be overturned. And when we were arrested, there were probably approximately 50 adoptions that were in process. Those adoptions were picked up by another agency, and all those were complete. So if we were doing such erroneous, terrible things, why were all the adoptions completed? Why were none of the children returned? Why were none of the adoptions overturned? There were no birth parents from Ethiopia that have come back and said they want their child. There's no visa that's overturned. The adoptions that were in process continued and were completed. So what's the problem?
If such a dramatic mistake has been made, why are you still in this judicial cycle?
Well, that goes, I've learned a lot about the judicial system, and I've learned a lot about cases. And, the case of Al Capone, he was arrested, and they were trying to get him for murder. Well, what got Al Capone was tax evasion. So what I found about the U.S. judicial system is if they can't get you on what they arrested you for, they're going to try to get you on something else.
Wow.
So
they're trying to criminalize you, even though they've now come to a point where what they were trying to criminalize you over no longer exists.
So what they did was, I didn't have money to hire a private lawyer, and I realized my public defenders were not going to go to. They were not prepared for trial. They had not reviewed all the evidence. They would not even let me get the evidence. They wouldn't look at the laws with me. All they wanted me to do is plea, and I was not going to plea because I was not guilty of adoption fraud. I just wasn't going to do it. And so when the government realized that I was going to take them to task and make them go to court over that, they came to me and they said, look, if you'll plead guilty to making a false statement to the Council on Accreditation, which is just a minor issue, that we will drop the indictment. And my lawyer advised me that would be the quickest way to get over this, and I could move on with my life. And so in January of 2015, I said, okay, just let's get this over with. I'll agree to making a false statement. And if you'll look at, most cases, and it was my understanding I'd get some probation and this would all be over with. Well, that's been 3 years ago. What happened was, I think, the government agreed to drop this indictment, and I think they looked bad because they dropped the indictment. So after I agreed to plead guilty to making a simple false statement, and I agreed to some probationary time for making a false statement to the accrediting body, which I didn't do, but I agreed to plead. The plea system in the United States manipulates you. You don't have any choice but to plea to get it over with. And I didn't have the money to pay for appropriate lawyers, so I really had no choice. I took that plea, and since that time, the government has tried to make me guilty of other things. So it's kind of like if they can't get you on something else, they make up something else. So they realized that this case was not going anywhere, so now they've gone into something else. And now I tried to withdraw that plea based on what I pled to a law that didn't come into effect until 5 months after my arrest. That's a whole different conversation. So my lawyer just finished. I have a great lawyer now. He is court appointed, but he is a great lawyer, and he just filed an appeal for me to appeal my sentence and my. It took 2.5 years for me to even get sentenced on that simple plea. And they sentenced me to 18 months in prison for making a false statement to an accrediting body about my false statement was that my non-Hague cases did not meet Hague regulations, which they didn't have to because the Hague did not apply to Ethiopia or to any of the adoption cases that we were providing. So my lawyer has filed an appeal for that. And that'll probably be another year. By the time this is over, it'll be at least 5 years in the making.
Wow. So, where do you see yourself going?
Well, my hope is that the fort will be in the Fourth Circuit, which is in Richmond, Virginia. And I'm hoping that what will happen is the Fourth Circuit will look at this case and say she was found guilty of violation of a Hague regulation, but she was not completing any Hague adoptions, and so this law did not apply to her, and throw the whole case out.
Wow. So, do you have confidence in a system that has already tried to criminalize you to decriminalize you, or?
Well, I feel like when I get to the Fourth Circuit, you're going to get in front of judges that don't owe anybody any favors. You're going to get in front of judges that, are not beholding to the prosecution. They're not beholding to my lawyer. They're just going by the law. And I think I'll get a fair shake. I feel like down in South Carolina, I've been in the Good Old Boy Network. And I feel like, even though it is the federal system, I feel like that I feel like the case is political. I feel like it's a witch hunt. I feel like the case was made to sensationalize and criminalize international adoptions. There has been another adoption agency, EAC, European Adoption Consultants, out of Ohio, was raided and arrested almost a year ago, but they have yet to be indicted. I don't know anything about the case. Ever since the raid and the arrest of the director, there's been nothing on the internet and no indictment. My feeling is that this agency has lawyers and they had money and they were able to hire lawyers to represent them appropriately, and they have been able to prove that they shouldn't be indicted. Our case, which is interesting, our agency paid for $1 million worth of professional liability coverage. We had full liability coverage. We had a nonprofit with a board of directors. We had paid for board insurance and liability insurance for since 2002. The minute we were arrested, our insurance company dropped us and refused to send a lawyer to represent us. And so we were left out in the cold. And, I was making $22,000 a year working for this company. I had a second job making about $24,000 a year. So I was not a rich person. I had about $50,000 in the bank, and that was gone in 3 months. So to represent yourself in a federal case, you need $500,000, if not $1 million. So, and the government knows that. And
they just grind you into the ground, don't they?
Right. Yeah, they beat you and beat you and beat you because they, for example, I have one lawyer. There's probably 6 lawyers representing the government. The government has unlimited funds, unlimited resources, and they don't mind spending them.
Has this case and these proceedings and the governmental approach and conduct towards you, has it affected your work in any way?
Well, I'm no longer working in adoptions. I'm actually waiting tables and trying to support my 3 children who are in college. I consider myself now the working poor.
But is that out of choice? Is that out of choice, or is that because of how they've conducted themselves with you?
Well, I don't think anybody would hire me to work in adoptions at this point.
That's the kind of point.
Yeah,
I was
and there's
getting
no
to.
work in adoption. Adoptions over 5,000. Adoptions are down 80%. Adoption agencies are closing left and right. There's substantial numbers. There's only going to be a few adoption agencies left.
So what's happening to these children?
They're languishing and dying in orphanages.
That's absolutely shocking.
Mm-hmm. Now, other countries, like Russian adoptions have closed, but I think Italy can still adopt from Russia. I'm not sure what countries the UK can adopt from, but just because a country closes, for example, just because Americans can adopt from Russia doesn't mean another country couldn't. Every country, countries can work together. And just because every country's different, their relationships with each country, their bilateral agreements. But in all, the numbers of orphans are the same or going up. There's plenty of orphans out in the world. There's plenty of children that need families and homes. But there's so many people out there. Like I said, I think it's a witch hunt. I think people have sensationalized, corruption in adoption, and I think it goes back to people are afraid of what they don't understand, and I think it goes back to cultural issues. When I started working in Ethiopia, there were very few laws, and there would be women. There's a book called "There's No Me Without You." It's a book about a woman that adopted from Ethiopia, and she tells a story about, dying women just knocking on the doors of neighbors saying, "Please take my child." There was no real adoption. When people died of AIDS, the neighbors just took the children. And what was happening is neighbors were ending up with 6, 7, 8, 10 children that weren't even theirs. And after a while, they couldn't take in any more children. And so these people that were taking in children, they ended up being orphanages. Before they knew it, they had 20 children living in their homes. And so, that's kind of how orphanages started. And when we started our orphanages, people would just show up and say, I found this kid on the street, take this kid. We'd have to say, look, you have to go through the proper process. Somebody would bring a child to our orphanage. We would immediately call the authorities. The authorities would come to a thorough investigation and make a decision whether the child could stay in our care or not. Sometimes the authorities would leave a child in our care because they didn't have anywhere else to put it. And then slowly more regulations started to form. But when we got licensed in 2006 in Ethiopia, there were very few regulations, and international adoptions were just starting to pick up there. And, there were up in our representative went to a meeting, and when women were put in prison for various things of breaking the law, their children had to go to prison with them. There were children in the prison with the mothers because when they arrested the mothers, they had nowhere to take the children. And they were asking us, please come take these children. And we couldn't legally take them. There was no paperwork. So with war and famine and floods and AIDS, there's lots of children out there. There's more NGOs coming, to help these children. There's more orphanages. Some people do turn in their children into orphanages and then go back and pick them up. But there's still a big need for international adoptions, and I really wish I knew what the answer was to fix it. I'm hoping there's people out there smarter than me that can fix it. I honestly don't want any part of it anymore. Sorry to say that I'm burned out. I wish everybody luck in fixing the problem and wish that I could do something to help. But I think the government, the U.S. government, obviously there's a war on international adoption and the U.S. government is winning. The statistics show that, down 80%. And if the government doesn't want international adoptions, there's not a whole lot we can do about that.
Well, Mary Mooney, I think that's a sad indictment on us as a people, as a race, as a society, as nations. I believe that Denmark is one of the countries that have actually banned adoptions from Ethiopia. Ethiopia themselves have banned international adoptions. You've had celebrities such as Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie who are amongst those who have adopted children from Ethiopia, and over 15,000 children have been adopted by Americans from Ethiopia since 1999. But that's coming to a very slow dribble and end.
Yeah, the sad part is there's many families across the United States that have gotten caught up in, they've actually adopted their children in the Congo or adopted their children in Haiti or adopted their children in Ethiopia, and then the country shut down. And so they have a child that is legally belongs to them, but they are not able to get a visa to bring the child to the United States, and it's just heartbreaking. And there's been many families whose children have died waiting to get a visa. The children are sick or they've died. Literally, families have adopted children for the children to die in a foreign country before they're ever able to bring the child home.
Quick last point before we finish. I mean, the adoption process in Ethiopia has faced serious questions with rights groups saying that it was prone to abuse by human traffickers who saw it as a lucrative market. Lawmakers now say orphans and other vulnerable children should be cared for under locally available support mechanisms in order to protect them. But politicians and activists are saying that the country has insufficient local services to cater for vulnerable children.
They do. That people don't understand. In the United States and the UK, we have social services. We have government entities we have food stamps. We have Medicaid. We have Medicare. In these countries, they do not have, they don't have the welfare systems that we do. So when a woman has 3 or 4 children and nowhere to care for them, it's not like she can go sign up for food stamps. They don't have the infrastructure that the social welfare programs that we have. They don't have the money. They don't have the resources to take care of the children that need the care. And the sad part is children have no rights. That they can't vote. They can't work. The children are vulnerable. They're vulnerable people that we need to look after. And it would be a perfect world if we could take care of them in their country of origin and get their, the Ethiopia families could get subsidies and raise these children like we do in the United States in foster care, but they don't have those resources. They don't have that set up to look after the great number of children they need to look after.
And I would hazard a guess that for the amount of children that are falling through the net and being abused or taken advantage of, those that are being helped and their lives have been enhanced far outweigh and is more than likely worth the effort in trying to bring them back to a better place than leaving them where they are.
Yeah, it's children deserve to have a family. First and foremost, they deserve to have a family. Yes, their culture is important, but when families adopt from Ethiopia, from the U.S., I would say most of the families embrace the culture where the child comes from, and they're more than willing to take the children back to visit their homeland country and to keep their culture. And I think having a family should be first and foremost. It's proven that a child does better in a family than they do in an orphanage situation.
Well, Mary, all I can say is thank you for sharing your story with us here today on Issues Today on World Jam Global Radio. And if there's anything that we can do to support you now or in the future, please don't hesitate to contact us. Is there anything that's left to be said that hasn't been said that you'd want to say just before we close?
No, I appreciate it. I'm willing to give more details on my case if anybody would like to hear them. We didn't go into too much of the details because it is about the children, but my case is still ongoing, and I'm more than happy to send documents, proof of, any kind of documentation that anybody would like to see.
Well, Mary, we wish you luck with your case. And again, as I said, I reiterate, anything that we can do to support you, we will gladly do. It's been great hearing the work that you've done. We take our hats off to you. Not everybody understands what it is about adoption, fostering, and looking after children from broken lives. But you definitely have a handle on it. You've done your work, you've done your homework and your groundwork, and I think we're saddened that it's actually got to this, that children are losing their lives and children are being left to die in these sad circumstances that we hear about.
And thank you for bringing this to light. Thank you for having me on your show and giving me my opportunity to speak. The government never let me speak, and so it's nice to be able to be able to tell my story.
Well, thank you again, Mary, and we look forward to hearing from you real soon.
Okay, goodbye.
God bless. Goodbye.
World Jam Global Radio, this is Clarity.
World Jam Global Radio presents
All because the lady loves.
your World Jam DJs on the night will be Early B spinning the best in future grooves. Also, you'll have DJ Mac, DJ Laro from the original Emotion Sound. Also, Younger General from Black Mountain Sound. Performing on the night will be Camilla Marcel singing her new single, Life. Also, we have Sugar Ray performing his latest single, Shake It Down. There will be loads of giveaways on the night. Also, prizes for the best dressed couple, which will be judged by our professional photographer coming from Cool Vibes Studio. Prizes for the best romantic dancing couple on the night. Of course, we have our own judges, which will be the Dirty Rub Up crew. We'll be checking that out, so look out for that one. On the 14th of February 2018 at the Junction House, 578 Kingston High Road, London, E84AH. Tickets for this Valentine's affair is set at £20 for couples and £15 for singles. Tickets available at the following: 3Ws, worldjamglobal.com, located on the events page where you can click and purchase your tickets, or on the ticket hotline number of 07802 302450. You can also purchase tickets from any of the World Jam Global DJs performing on the night. Dressed to impress, professional photographers on site all night.
All because the lady loves.
World Jam Global Radio, this is Clarity.
I already did my time. I paid for my crime. I already did my time. I paid for my crime.
Well, that was the story of Mary Mooney from North Carolina, talking about international adoptions
Paid for my crime.
and how her career was brought to a sudden halt.
I already did my time. I paid for my crime. Back in the day,
Don't forget, you can catch me tomorrow morning live at 8 o'clock GMT
it was
for another edition of the Wake Up Everybody's Sunday Gospel Show.
young and foolish to stay in school. I learned
That's where I do church before church. Play your gospel in a different style.
with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I
But
had
as for me and for tonight, we're out of here.
money. Life is so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent. I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison.
Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Pay for my crime, pay for my crime, pay for my crime, pay for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. I'm trying to get this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen, statewide, worldwide. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all
World Jam
in
Global
jail.
Radio, this is
Trying
Clarity.
to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you.